In this second part of my review of Campbell's book, Basics of Verbal Aspect, I will review chapters 2 through 5. Before we get into the review, however, there are 3 issues I want to address. First, my original post received a variety of responses, some positive and some negative. Campbell himself posted his own thoughts, and if I may try to summarize it, I would say that he felt personally attacked. Let me repeat what I said in the first video. I am not trying to bash Campbell. I'm trying to help students. And so is Campbell. I applaud him for that. He wrote a book about aspect in Greek that was aimed at students and scholars who are not in the field of linguistics. My aim is the same. The reason why I'm not writing a review of his book and sending it to some journal where it will be read by a handful of people is because I don't believe that is the most effective way to teach students. These videos will get way more engagement from students and even scholars than a review in a journal. And that is what I'm after. I'm attempting to do this in a format that is engaging and helpful for students. As an aside, Zondervan was also giving out free copies of the book to anyone within the Nerdy Biblical Language Majors group on Facebook. You can check out that lively Facebook group if you don't know about it already. And they did this in exchange for an honest review. I purchased the book myself, but I took this offer to be a sign that Zondervan wanted honest, fair reviews of this book. Although I disagree with Campbell, I'm trying to be both honest and fair. So that is further justification for reviewing this book in particular, and not Campbell's PhD dissertation on the subject, for example, and for doing so in this format. The second related point is that I want to personally encourage everyone to be cordial and respectful in their comments. I have refilmed this video in part to attempt to be as respectful as possible and to encourage others to do the same. Here, I would like to quote Campbell at the end of chapter 2. He says, "It would help to take the heat out of debates around Greek verbs. It's weird that tense forms of an ancient language should generate so much passion and, at times, acrimony. Greek scholars are all trying to achieve more or less the same thing, to arrive at a more accurate understanding of how Greek verbs contribute meaning to ancient texts, including the Bible. Other disciplines within biblical studies manage to work through their differences without denouncing, mocking, or discrediting their opponents. Why can't Greek scholars?" Again, I applaud him for this and agree with him. I want to encourage all who listen to this to engage with the substance of what is being said on both sides and come to your own conclusions. If you do come to a conclusion, either for or against Campbell, I encourage you to express that conclusion with humility and respect if you wish to express it at all. Campbell has worked for a long time on this project, and it is not easy to have someone critique something you have worked hard on. Please acknowledge and respect that. Please. To attack the person behind the opinion is not just unhelpful, it is not Christ-like, which is what we should all be striving for. And this brings me to my last point, which is more substantive and has to do with terminology. I tried very hard not to denounce or mock Campbell in my review of chapter 1, but I can imagine how one could think I was trying to discredit him, particularly with the question of how to understand terms. I said that Campbell used the terms aspect and actionsart wrongly. In some ways, how you use technical terms does not really matter, but in other ways, it does. Let me explain. I began by saying that Campbell had the wrong definition of aspect, and that he wrongly drew a distinction between viewpoint aspect on the one hand and temporal notions of aspect on the other. The term viewpoint aspect comes from Carlotta Smith, and she explicitly defines it as temporal. My claim was stronger. Linguists working on aspect universally describe it as temporal. Here are some examples from introductory semantics textbooks or reference works. Nick Reimer says that aspect is about whether time is seen as moving through the event or about time in the event. Paul Krager says aspect indicates a temporal relation between the topic time and time of situation. Susan Rothstein says aspectual properties of a verbal predicate reflect the internal temporal makeup of the situations or events denoted by the predicate. In addition to being found in all kinds of linguistics works, and if there are any counterexamples that I don't know of, feel free to comment about them. This definition is also standard in more open source platforms, such as Wikipedia, which says, in linguistics, aspect is a grammatical category that expresses how a verbal action, event, or state extends over time. Our friend ChatGPT says something similar. Grammatical aspect is a linguistic feature that conveys the nature of an action or state in terms of its temporal structure and progress. It helps to express how an event or action unfolds over time. Finally, the World Atlas of Language Structures is an online database that can be found at wals.info. It is a database of hundreds of languages, where they are each categorized by certain features. In their introduction to tense and aspect, they state the following. Among the multitudinous definitions of tense and aspect in the literature, we may cite those given in Comrie, 1985, page 6. Tense is grammaticalization of location in time, and aspect is grammaticalization of expression of internal temporal constituency of events, processes, etc. Thus defined, the two categories are conceptually close in that both deal with time. This might sound like there is not agreement in the field of linguistics on the definition of aspect, but everyone they cite, though having slightly different definitions of aspect, agree that it is temporal. The heterogeneity of the field, which honestly I often hear from biblical scholars, but not from linguists, is not whether aspect is temporal, but it is how precisely to define aspect temporally. I belabor this point because when I said Campbell is wrong about his definition of aspect, what I meant was that the field of linguistics uses it in a different way, as shown by all the examples, and we could give dozens more. If the way Campbell used the term aspect applied only to Greek grammatical studies, we would then have to evaluate how those scholars are using the term. However, Campbell does not claim that his definition of aspect only applies to Greek. While acknowledging the temporal view, he also suggests that his definition is general and can apply to English, even stating that most, if not all, languages have ways of expressing these two different viewpoints. His example on page 10 for English is, I walked down the street versus I was walking down the street. Campbell says that the difference between these two sentences is verbal aspect. Here's where terminology matters. Everyone agrees that the difference between walked and was walking is aspect. However, Campbell defines aspect differently than all the linguists who wrote the introductory textbooks, the open source definitions of aspect, and the World Atlas of Language Structures that is categorizing hundreds and hundreds of languages based on that definition. All the linguists I have cited are defining it temporally. Campbell explicitly claims that it is not temporal, and he presents his claim as if Comrie is a revolutionary within the linguistics world and is not followed by the entire field. In this instance, terminology matters. Either the distinction between walked and was walking is temporal, or it is not. Linguists have argued that the distinction is temporal. They call that distinction aspect. Campbell has argued that the distinction is not fundamentally temporal. He also calls that same distinction aspect. When I say that Campbell has the wrong definition of aspect, I mean that he does not use the accepted definition in the field that has come up with that technical term. In other instances, terminology is less consequential. For example, I'm not going to provide all the examples for the term actionsart that I did for aspect, but I could do the exact same thing. It is universally regarded as the temporal structure of the event and not the interpretation of a verbal description in context. Both Ed built a Lego house and Ed was building a Lego house have the same actionsart value, even though they have different interpretations. Both refer to a building a Lego house event, which has a natural endpoint, namely when the Lego house is completely built. They have different interpretations in that Ed built a Lego house references the endpoint. I infer that the Lego house has been built. But Ed was building a Lego house does not reference the endpoint. I cannot infer that the Lego house has been completely built. Campbell uses the term actionsart to refer to the interpretation of the sentences rather than the contribution by the verbal description, namely that the event has a natural endpoint or not, or all kinds of other characteristics. This is not how linguists use the term actionsart today. But this does not matter very much, other than that it can be confusing to people who read about actionsart on Wikipedia or in semantics textbooks. As much as possible, I will point out these differences to help you understand this confusing world. But I will not evaluate Campbell's actual analysis based on my definitions. He needs to be read using his own terms. What he calls actionsart, I would call the interpretation of a verbal form or one of its uses. In this case, the terminological distinction is not as consequential. As we will see though, our differences are not just about terminology. The issue is that the categories and terminologies change the way we analyze the text. Let's now get into chapter 2, which covers some of the history of the field, particularly within Greek grammatical studies, and it focuses especially on the last 50 years or so. In Campbell's survey of scholars who have worked on Greek aspect, the only linguist proper cited is Marie Broman Olsen, who did her PhD in linguistics at Northwestern University and wrote on aspect in English and Koine Greek. And that is what I mean by linguist proper. She has a degree in linguistics, and she works in that field. Campbell cites her as defining aspect differently, namely as temporal. He says that she follows Comrie in this respect, but as we have said, this is everyone within linguistics. Other formal semantics scholars who have worked on aspect in classical and New Testament Greek are not cited. For example, Gero and von Stichau's work on the diachrony of the Greek perfect, in which they discuss the New Testament, is not mentioned. Likewise, Corian Berry's dissertation, Aspect in Ancient Greek, is also not cited. Though one could argue this is because she is dealing with classical Greek rather than post-classical or New Testament Greek, her analyses remain valuable and useful for all students of New Testament Greek. In a later video, I will return to Campbell's review of the Greek verb revisited. Instead of going through the other scholars one by one, it is probably more helpful to go over the main area of agreement in the field. Campbell's first point is that aspect is defined as viewpoint, which is a spatial rather than temporal concept. We have already cited copious works from linguistics to show that this is not how linguists define the term. The fact that this is an area of agreement within studies on aspect in the New Testament shows that the authors surveyed disagree with the field of linguistics. This does not tell us who is correct, but we would then have to conclude that the scholars who have spent their entire lives categorizing hundreds of languages based on a temporal aspectual distinction are all wrong. We would also have to conclude that aspectologists, no, I did not make that term up, these are the linguists who are working in aspect specifically. These are people like Susan Rothstein, Daniel Altschuler, Hannah Philippe. They're also all wrong. They all agree that aspect is temporal and have spent much of their careers trying to figure out what aspect is and to define it properly. But most importantly, I will show that the temporal definition of aspect explains the data. Campbell's next section is an excursus on tense. So what is tense exactly? Campbell defines it as the ways in which verbs indicate time, specifically the time at which verbal actions take place. And he clarifies that tense always indicates time in relation to something else. From these statements, Campbell's definition of tense can be summarized as the relationship between the time of the situation or eventuality and another time, usually the time of speaking. The terms situation or eventuality are used in linguistics as a cover term for events or states that verbs refer to. This is what Campbell calls the verbal action. But because not all verbs refer to actions, I will use the term situation or eventuality as linguists do. So that's just an aside. So is tense the relationship between the eventuality and the time of speaking? It is not. Sentences like Emmett has eaten pizza show that this is not the case. The tense in this sentence must be in the present, since we cannot combine this with past referring adverbs. You cannot say, Emmett has eaten pizza yesterday. However, if I am asked the question, has Emmett ever eaten pizza? I can answer, Emmett has eaten pizza, even when the event took place yesterday. This means that the time we are referring to with an adverb like yesterday is not necessarily the same as when the event took place. Essentially, this means that we have 3 time periods in such an example. We have the time when the event took place in the world. That was yesterday. And then we have the time when the statement was made. That's the speech time. and that's the present. We also have a third time, the time we are talking about, which linguists call the reference time or topic time. In the case of Emmett has eaten pizza, the reference time is the present, since we cannot use past adverbs, but the time of the eventuality is in the past, since Emmett actually did eat pizza yesterday. In other words, the perfect have form in English necessarily refers to the present even when a past situation has occurred. This gives us the tools to define tense. It is the relationship between the time of speaking and the reference time, and not the relationship between the time of speaking and the time of the eventuality. Even the speech time, however, has its own complexities. It would be perfectly natural for me to start a story about ancient Rome with the year is 44 BC. Julius Caesar has just been killed. Despite the fact that the year is not 44 BC and Julius Caesar was not just killed, we can use the present tense to talk about a year that occurred before our present moment. The narrator can place himself at any time period in a story, and tense is then related to that time period rather than the narrator's real time of writing or speaking. This shows that tense is actually not the relationship between the reference time and the time of speaking, but between the reference time and some temporal anchor, which is only sometimes the time of speaking. The so-called historical present is not an argument against the present form being a present tense, either in English or in Greek. It is an illustration of how the temporal anchor may change in stories. Coming back to Campbell's discussion of tense, he says that the aorist indicative refers to the past 85% of the time, and the present form refers to present time only 70% of the time. But if he is relating the time of speaking to the time of the eventuality, then these statistics don't mean anything. Linguists wouldn't call that present or past tense to begin with. Instead of explaining the data by looking more closely at the definition of tense, Campbell essentially claims that the issue is about whether you hold to the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. I hold to this distinction. Again, see video 1 and my 2 videos on the basics of semantics and pragmatics. But this is really not the real issue here. The real issue here is the theoretical definition of tense to begin with, which led to the data being tallied in the way that it has been. The present tense form refers to present tense 70% of the time under Campbell's definition of tense, but not under my definition of tense, which is how linguists would define it. Again, we will soon see how this affects our explanation of the data. Chapters 3 to 5 are where Campbell analyzes the data. If you are able, I encourage you to have a Greek New Testament open as we go through these examples. There will also be examples on the screen if you are watching this. If you are just listening, it might be a good idea to go back and listen to this section with your Greek Bible open. I am digging into the weeds of the data because our analyses are only as good as they account for the data. The basic structure of each chapter will be me presenting Campbell's view of the various aspects and contrasting that with the accepted views in linguistics. We will then go through each of the examples Campbell cites, as well as some of my own from the New Testament, to see how the two theories stack up against each other. Again, my aim in doing this is to help students see the differences between Campbell's theory and that espoused by semanticists and aspectologists today. Campbell starts chapter 3 with a definition of perfective aspect, where he describes it as an all-encompassing or summary view of an action, where the details are not appreciated. The difficult thing about such a claim is that it is not falsifiable. In other words, I don't know when the details of an event are unappreciated enough to make it fit this definition. So I don't know how to test whether Campbell's theory is correct and what criteria could be given for how detailed an event description is in the first place. Again, it must be stressed that Campbell is making a claim about perfective aspect and not just a particular form in Koine Greek. The definition he provides should work for all languages with forms that encode perfective aspect. To illustrate how Campbell's analysis differs from modern aspectologists, we can look at Daniel Altschuler's definition of the perfective in Slavic languages, which he gives the following formula for. Now, I'm not going to spend the rest of our time together explaining everything going on in this formula, but it gives you a taste of what aspectologists are doing to define aspect. Altschuler's basic idea is that perfective aspect requires that a maximal stage of an event be reached. And he defines what a stage of an event is and what it means to reach such a stage. With a definition like this, we can determine whether he is right or wrong by looking at the data. If there are examples where the Russian perfective does not refer to a maximal stage of an event, as he defines it, his definition is wrong. We can look at Daniel Altschuler's definition of the perfective in Russian, which he gives the following formula for. So the question is, are the linguists correct about perfective aspect or the New Testament scholars, such as Campbell and those he cites in chapter 2, who agree that aspect is spatial? Let's see how each group would explain the data. Campbell cites Matthew 4:21 through 22 as an illustration of aorists that do not view the details of how the action took place. He explains that the three aorists, eiden, saw, ekalesen, called, and ekoluthesan, followed, are summaries and not details. He says, we are not told what Jesus said when he called them. We are not told about James's and John's thoughts in response to Jesus. We are not told whether they spoke to their father as they left him in the boat. We are told, quite simply, that they followed Jesus. And that's that. Campbell seems to suggest that if we were told what Jesus said when he called them, or what James and John were thinking, we would not have the aorist. But how descriptive is the aorist allowed to be? For example, 1 Thessalonians 4:7 says that God did not call us for impurity. U God ekalesen hemas hotheos epi akatharsia. There is more detail here in that what we have been called for is specified. And then there is Luke 14:16, where we again have the aorist indicative verb ekalesen. The following verse gives an explanation of what was said in the invitation and the manner in which the person invited everyone to his feast. Thus, there are a fair amount of details given here about the calling event, but the aorist is still used. Without Campbell specifying what it means for an event description to be detailed or not, it is not possible to prove or disprove his claim about what the aorist means. Linguists would not analyze a perfective morpheme like the aorist as having to do with the level of descriptiveness of the eventuality being described. It simply says that there is some temporal boundary being referred to, whether the beginning or end of the eventuality. We can nuance that definition of perfective aspect, and indeed, it has been nuanced in linguistics. We have said that Altshuler calls it a max stage of an eventuality. Carlotta Smith says it includes the initial and final endpoint. And Wals says that it is the normal form to refer to a single completed event in the past. In each case, the essential definition is the same. A temporal boundary must be included. The aorist indicatives in Matthew 4:21 through 22 conform to this definition. Each of the event descriptions include the end of the event. Jesus saw Aiden, two other brothers. That is, the event of Jesus perceiving them with his eyes actually took place and ended. After that, he called ekalesen them. This calling event is also presented as having occurred and ended, as indicated by the response of James and John, responding to the call. They respond by following ekoludesan, Jesus. Again, this is an event where the end is reached. It is not talking about James and John following Jesus over the course of their lives. It just means that they did what Jesus called them to do. He wanted them to leave their boat and father and join the group of followers. They did that. Event over. Besides Campbell's wrong definition of perfective aspect, which leads to the wrong analysis, he also claims that the aorist indicative does not encode tense. The one example he gives is Mark 1:11, though he says 15% of the examples do not refer to past tense. I have another 10-minute video on why this example in Mark 1:11 is not a counterexample, and you can check that out for yourself. The short explanation of Mark 1:11 is that this use falls into a special category called performatives. As a performative, the speaker's speech enacts the event itself. Hence, the event begins and ends with the speaker's speech. By the time God finishes saying, "En soy el doke esa," the event has ended. Because the event ends when the utterance is over, some languages allow for past tense forms to be used for performatives. Koine Greek is one such language. There are also examples in classical Greek as well for this use of the aorist, and you can check out Corian Berry's semantic explanation for it, which I don't agree with entirely, of course, because linguists don't always agree with each other entirely, but I do think it is essentially correct. Campbell does not get into the other 15% of instances where the aorist is supposedly not past. But my claim is that they can all be accounted for with the proper understanding of tense and aspect. Going through the other examples is a project for another day. Campbell rejects a tense analysis of the aorist in favor of a remoteness analysis, which he describes as the metaphorical value of distance. It is true that some languages, such as Zulu, encode remoteness in verbal forms, but this is always remoteness in time. The remote past tense is more distant temporally from the speaker than the recent past. Campbell seems to essentially say that the aorist is remote, not in terms of temporality, but in terms of descriptiveness, much like how he described perfective aspect. He says that with a remote form, the view is a summary view, precisely because the parade is viewed from a distance. However, Campbell goes on to say that remoteness may also be temporal, and is so 85% of the time. Besides presenting remoteness as a summary view, Campbell also mentions logical remoteness. Campbell uses the idea of remoteness to explain Mark 1:11. In Campbell's explanation of Mark 1:11, he seems to suggest that remoteness is spatial. He says, certain things in the context indicate that this assessment comes from heaven itself and breaks into the earthly scene. The effect of these elements is that the verdict of heaven upon Jesus is being delivered from heaven to earth, as it were. And again, this scene is depicted from a vantage point somewhat similar to a helicopter, namely from heaven itself. I don't know how to understand this if it is not spatial. And as I pointed out in a previous video, and as we will get to later on, verbal forms do not encode spatial categories. But the deeper issue with this is that it does not explain other performative examples in Greek more broadly. Performatives are rare, so we should not expect many examples in the New Testament. While it might be true that heaven is spatially distant from earth, though I would certainly not want to make that kind of claim about ancient cosmology from the use of the aorist in this passage. This explanation still does not work for other performative aorists found in Greek literature more broadly. Corian Berry cites an example from Euripides, which says, "To de protimon enesa," but I approve your eagerness. There is no sense in which Iphigenia can be argued to be distant from Orestes in this example. The temporal explanation, however, works for all such examples where the two interlocutors are not spatially remote. The last examples of the perfective in the chapter are from Matthew 8:32 through 34, which are about Jesus casting the demons out of the pigs. Campbell describes the effect of the narrative aorist as follows. In just 3 short verses, a huge amount of action is portrayed. The story moves from Jesus casting out the evil spirits right through to the town casting out Jesus. The passage is fast, compressed, and covers a lot of ground. Such is the effect of the narrative aorist. Narratives usually provide more information besides the skeletal outline of events, but such details are typically conveyed by other tense forms. My understanding of Campbell here is that the aorist is used because a lot of details are skipped over. It is used to cover a lot of ground, which seems to mean that it portrays a lot of different events that extend over a fairly long period of time. However, there are plenty of instances where the aorist is used in narrative to describe successive, detailed events that occur very close to one another in time. For example, Matthew 9:32 through 33 presents another instance of Jesus casting out a demon. Verse 32 says that a man was brought to Jesus, and the aorist indicative pros enenkan is used. The next aorist indicative is in verse 33. Elale sen hoko phos. The mute man spoke. And then the final aorist indicative is ethaumasan hoi ochloi. The crowds marveled. Again, without any criteria on what counts as detailed or covering a lot of ground, it is difficult for me to know what Campbell would say about a passage like this. However, these seem to be events that are extremely close together in time, and the mute man speaking and the crowd marveling seem to be details of the event of Jesus casting out a demon. If the aorist indicative encodes a summary view of eventualities as a semantic value, we should not expect examples like these. The temporal explanation for temporal succession is very simple on the surface, though it does get complex, and it is again standard in linguistics. Perfective forms are typically used for narrative progression because they refer to temporal boundaries. Narrative is, by definition, successive events in time. By referring to different events with temporal boundaries, that is, by using different verbs all with perfective aspect, the effect is that one event happens after the next in the story. Sometimes the events are actually very close in time. and represent details of a story. At other times, the events are in reality quite spread out over time. The level of detail is not determined by the perfective, but by the verbs that are chosen and how they relate to one another. For a linguistics discussion, I would refer you to the oft-cited work by Nicholas Asher and Alex Laskardidis. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Temporal interpretation, discourse relations, and common sense entailment. According to Campbell's description of the aorist, it encodes perfective aspect and remoteness. Perfective aspect is described as a summary, non-detailed view of the eventuality. Remoteness is described as a summary view. Temporal remoteness, logical remoteness, or spatial remoteness. It is easy for these views to become circular without more precise definitions for what counts as detailed versus a summary, or remote versus proximate. No criteria has been given for an event description being summary enough to qualify for the speaker to use the aorist, or the speaker being distant enough in detail, temporality, logicality, or space to use the aorist. In his explanations, Campbell then inserts his description of the aorist into the data, but that description is the very thing we are trying to test against the data. The temporal view of the aorist is very simple. We should expect all aorist forms to refer to a temporal boundary of an event and to a time that occurs prior to a contextually salient temporal anchor. Not only do all linguists hold to this view of the perfective and past tense, but they do so because it fits the data in language after language. We now come to chapter 4, which is on imperfective aspect. Since perfective and imperfective aspect are described as opposites, some of the same concerns with Campbell's definition of perfective also apply to imperfective. He says that with the imperfective aspect, an action is presented as though unfolding before the eyes. He goes on to use an example from the progressive form in English to illustrate, when he says, "This is easy to appreciate in English. He is walking down the street is clearly cast before us as though we are watching it happen." Again, it is difficult to know what he means by this, because it is clearly metaphorical. We need not be watching someone walk down the street to utter the sentence. So what does it mean to be metaphorically watching it happen? Focusing on English first, linguists would not call the English be plus ing form an imperfective. They call it a progressive. Semanticists like Fred Landman have essentially defined the progressive as referring to a non-maximal stage of an event, though the progressive has received various treatments. However, all consider it to be temporal and to essentially disallow reference to the end of an event. So a sentence like, "He is walking down the street," does not cast the event before our eyes. It is simply referring to part of the entire walking down the street event. The way we know the progressive refers to only part of an event and not the event's endpoint is how it combines with events that have a natural endpoint. In the sentence, Amos is walking to the store, the endpoint is when Amos reaches the store. However, this description with the progressive, Amos is walking, does not tell us whether or not Amos actually reached the store. He could have been abducted by aliens just before he got there, so we cannot necessarily infer that Amos reached the store. In contrast, Amos walked to the store without the progressive in the simple past does normally mean that Amos reached the store. It sounds contradictory to say Amos walked to the store, but he didn't make it because he got abducted by aliens on the way. When we say Amos walked to the store, we infer that he got there. That is the perfective interpretation. Many working on aspectual theory define imperfective not as disallowing a maximal stage, but as not necessarily containing a maximal stage of an event. In contrast, the perfective would require a maximal stage. In other words, the imperfective allows for readings where the end of an event is reached, but the perfective aorist would require that interpretation. In fact, we do see overlap between the aspectual value of the present form and the aorist in the historical present. We will return to this in part 2 of the book, where Campbell treats the historical present. Coming back to Campbell, it is again difficult to know what would falsify his claim, but this also means that it cannot really be proven. Campbell uses the parable of the sower in Mark 4:14-20 to illustrate his theory. He concludes by saying that Jesus explains the parable of the sower by laying out its meaning before the disciples' eyes. But this hasn't been defined or demonstrated. It was asserted that this is what the imperfective is, and that the present form is an imperfective. A passage is then given with present forms, and it is asserted that these fit the definition previously given. However, the example needs to demonstrate that the description given is actually true, namely, before the disciples' eyes. How do we prove that? Campbell seems to suggest that the imperfective is used because the explanation of the parable is an explanation. But of course, there are plenty of general statements made with the present tense form that are not offering a more detailed explanation of something, such as in John 3:8, where we see to pneuma hoputhele pnei. The Spirit blows where it wishes. This is a very general statement, and in fact, the present tense form is often used for generics. It is also unclear how this could serve as a more detailed explanation for something previously said. The temporal explanation for the parable is that an inspecific person is being referred to, so each of the presents should be read as a general statement or a habitual. These are statements that occur regularly. When you have many occurrences of an event in the time that you are discussing, it makes sense to use an imperfective form, which is generally more protracted over time than perfectives. Once again, there are much more detailed explanations of the relationship between imperfective and the habitual. And you can check out the article by Edith Doron and Nora Bonnet, my former teachers from Israel, if you want to learn more about it. After the aspect of the present, Campbell discusses how it relates to the imperfect form. Because he does not accept tense as part of the Greek verbal system, he has to distinguish between the present and imperfect forms, which both have the same aspect. He again appeals to spatial notions to distinguish between the two forms. Since he has already defined aspect as spatial, he has now suggested two spatial parameters for the present tense form. It is imperfective in aspect, which he describes as a detailed viewpoint, as well as proximate. He does not present any examples under the section of proximity from pages 41 to 43. I will treat this concept when we come to his excursus on space and time. The last example he does discuss in his treatment of the present illustrates the historical present. He rightly notes that most of the examples of the historical present are limited to certain verb classes, which he calls verbs of propulsion and verbs that introduce discourse. Given that historical presents often do fall into certain verb classes, I also agree that this should be part of the explanation. Again, we will return to this use of the present when he returns to it in the second half of the book. The last form Campbell treats in chapter 4 is the imperfect. Within narrative, he rightly says that imperfect indicatives tend to provide supplemental information. It is true that this is a tendency, and that the imperfect form tends to describe details, provide reasons and explanations, and elucidates motivations. It would seem that these functions are why Campbell calls the imperfect form unimperfective, which he describes as being a more detailed view of the situation. However, this is only a tendency and is not part of the meaning of the form. It is hard to see how a sentence like we have in John 3:1 provides a reason, explanation, or motivation. It says, «Ein de anthropos ek ton Pharisaion, Nicodemus onomo auto, archon ton Judaion». There was a man from the Pharisees, Nicodemus, what's his name, who was a ruler of the Jews. Here, the imperfect verb ein introduces a character in the story. This cannot be providing extra details about Nicodemus because he is only introduced here. This does not seem to fit Campbell's definition of the imperfect as being a detailed, that is imperfective, remote form, that is one used in narrative. Again, the temporal explanation gives a reason why the imperfect would have a tendency to be used for background information in a narrative. Since perfective forms include the endpoint of an event, they move the narrative along. One event happens and ends, and then another event happens and ends, and so on. Since imperfective forms need not refer to the end of the event, they can refer to events that are happening simultaneously with another perfective form. For example, in a simple discourse, like Amos went to the store, he was listening to music. We interpret the event of Amos listening to music as happening at the same time as the event of Amos going to the store. Since Amos went to the store normally includes the endpoint, and Amos was listening to music does not, we interpret the listening to music event as being part of the going to the store event. In this sense, it provides more details, but that does not make the progressive form in code a more detailed event. It just happens to be used that way in narratives because of how the two events are related temporally. In fact, we don't need the progressive to provide more details. We can just as easily say, Amos went to the store. He listened to music on the way. In this case, the simple past form, normally equivalent to the perfective, is providing the extra details. Because we specified that the listening took place on the way, we understand that the events of going to the store and listening to music happened at the same time. In Campbell's example of Luke 9:42 through 45, not all imperfect verbs provide merely supplementary material. For example, the clause exeplesonto de pantes, all were astonished, refers to a response of the people within the narrative. After Jesus heals a boy and gives him back to his father, the people become astonished. The astonishment must happen after the healing. So this is an event on the main line sequence of events. And in fact, we saw the similar words ethaumasan in the aorist in Matthew 9:33, where it was also a main line event. In Luke 9:42, the reaction of all the people to a healing is described with exeplesonto in the imperfect. But in Matthew 9:33, the reaction of the crowds to a healing is described with the aorist, ethaumasan. If Campbell says that the imperfect, exeplesonto, is used in Luke 9:42 because it is a reaction, then we should also expect the reaction of ethaumasan to be in the imperfect, but it is an aorist. Our theory of the imperfective predicts overlap with the perfective, and this is where we see it. The verb exeplesonto is what linguists would call an achievement predicate. This just means that it has a natural endpoint, but no duration. With these kinds of verbs or predicates, the imperfective is predicted to overlap with the perfective, since the endpoint of the event is the only part of the event. If it takes place at all, it ends. Both the imperfective and perfective would then refer to the end of the event with these kinds of verbs, which is exactly what we see here in this mainline imperfect form verb. At this point, I want to briefly contrast the English and Greek verbal systems in order to show how they are different. This really has very little to do with Campbell's work in that it is not directly engaging with his claims, but hopefully it will help clarify how linguists view the different aspects we have discussed. And hopefully it will help when mapping English onto Greek and vice versa. In English, there are two past tense verb forms that we've talked about in relation to perfective and imperfective aspect, namely what is called a simple past form, as in Amos walked, and a progressive form, as in Amos was walking. We have said that the progressive form disallows reference to the final stage of an event. Thus, a sentence like Amos was walking to the store cannot refer to the part of the event where Amos actually reached the store. The simple past tense form, however, can refer to the end of the event. So we most naturally interpret Amos walked to the store as meaning that he arrived at the store. However, as has been pointed out in the literature, English's simple past form can also be interpreted to refer to only part of the event, similar to the progressive. With an example like Amos read the Bible during church, we do not refer to the end of the Bible reading event. We are not to understand this to mean that Amos finished the entire Bible, which would be the natural endpoint of such an event. Rather, it means that he only read part of the Bible, and this is basically an identical interpretation to the progressive counterpart. Amos was reading the Bible during church. Thus, English's system contrasts between a form that cannot refer to the end of an event, the progressive, and another form that may, but need not, refer to the end of the event, the simple past. In contrast to this, Greek's system morphologically marks the perfective meaning rather than the progressive. In other words, the contrast in its two forms is between one that necessarily includes a temporal boundary and one that may include a temporal boundary. This is why we see an overlap between the imperfect form and the aorist in our example comparing Luke 9:42 and Matthew 9:33. The imperfect form may still reference the end of an event. It just need not. However, because it is the only form that need not, it will often, but not always, get the opposite interpretation to the perfective form, just like the English progressive and the English simple past will often, but not always, have the opposite interpretation. Thus, the English progressive cannot refer to a temporal boundary, and the Greek aorist necessarily refers to a temporal boundary, and both languages have forms in the middle, namely the English simple past and the Greek imperfect. And both of these forms may or may not refer to a temporal boundary. Because of how the different systems mark temporal boundaries, there will not be a one-to-one relationship between any of the forms. The imperfective forms in Greek, namely the present and the imperfect, may map onto either the progressive or the simple past/present tenses. In contrast, the perfective form in Greek may map onto the simple past tense, but the prediction is that it will not map on to the English progressive form. Given how the two systems are set up, that is the only relationship that is disallowed. Hopefully, this helps you if you are trying to figure out how to understand and translate between English and Greek. I know we are in the weeds of the analysis, but the details matter. The Greek imperfective forms are often equated with the English progressive, but this is not how the two systems map onto each other. And linguists today do not equate progressive and imperfective forms. These kinds of details affect our translations, and they make or break our theories. The last form Campbell treats in part 1 of the book is the perfect. He presents different scholars who have worked on the perfect in New Testament studies, but he does not present any linguists who have worked on it in classical or New Testament Greek. For treatment of the perfect from a semanticist, I would refer you to the work of Garrow and von Sichow, who give a diachronic analysis of the perfect and who also treat the New Testament period, and they also mention the New Testament itself. This chapter has the most data in terms of examples, and it also engages far more with other theories of the perfect. I do not want to just evaluate Campbell's evaluation of other scholars. Instead, I again want to present the standard temporal theory in linguistics and contrast that with Campbell's. Honestly, critiques could be made for the other theories presented in the chapter as well, when compared to the theory in modern semantics, but that will have to wait for a different occasion. Before getting into the theory, I want to show how Campbell reasons through his critique of other theories, and I want to affirm how he does it. He begins with the so-called traditional view. He says, traditionally, the perfect indicative tense form was understood as indicating a past action with ongoing consequences. The great problem with this analysis is that it doesn't work. It yields far too many exceptions. Campbell goes on to list some exceptions, such as John 1:26, which says, Mesos humon hesteken hon humes uk oidete. Someone in the midst of you stands whom you do not know. The verb hesteken, stand, and oidete, know, are both present statives. Campbell rightly points out that this is a case where the data does not seem to fit the description of a past action with ongoing consequences. On the surface, it is difficult to see how there is a past action here, because there is a mismatch between the data and our description. We need to adjust our description of the form to match the data. This is what we are trying to do when we do semantics, and Campbell is doing it correctly here. This is exactly what we have done in the previous chapter with Campbell's description of the forms. He says that the perfective is not detailed and that the imperfective is detailed. We then need to check that against the data. As I've said, it is difficult to check level of detail because that is itself a subjective notion. But the point is that when we are evaluating different theories, this is what we are trying to do. See what the theory predicts in terms of the range of interpretations of a form, and then test that prediction against the data. In order to introduce the temporal theory, we need to clarify the temporal nature of aspect. We have said that all linguists regard it as temporal, but this does not explain what it refers to. Aspect is the relationship between the time of the eventuality and the time that the speaker is referring to, which we called earlier the reference time or topic time. Because aspect is fundamentally a relationship between two time intervals, we can conceive of different kinds of relationships between the two intervals. For example, one interval can be included within the other, or that same interval could extend beyond the other. This is the basic distinction between perfective and imperfective aspect. Perfective aspect includes the entire time of the eventuality within whatever time the speaker is referring to. This is why the end of the event is referenced in a sentence like, Amos walked to the store. The speaker includes Amos reaching the store in the event description, so we can conclude that he is there. Imperfective aspect, on the other hand, has the time of the eventuality extending beyond whatever time the speaker is referring to. This is why the end of the event is typically not reached in imperfective events, such as in Amos was walking to the store, where the speaker does not include Amos actually reaching the store in the event description. Both of these need to be nuanced to account for the data, especially the imperfective, which we have said allows for the in-progress interpretation, but doesn't actually require it, like the progressive form. But you get the general idea of the distinction between these two interpretations. The basic idea of the perfect is likewise very simple. The time of the eventuality occurs prior to the time the speaker is talking about. This is where the traditional notion of past action with present consequences comes from. But as Campbell rightly points out, this description alone does not account for the data. So how do linguists deal with the multiplicity of readings of the perfect? First, it should be noted that not all perfect forms across languages are identical. The English perfect famously disallows past time adverbials. The sentence, Amos has walked to the store yesterday, is ungrammatical. The German perfect, however, does allow for past time adverbials, so the equivalent sentence is grammatical. With the Greek perfect, we would need to account for the standard readings of the perfect and then nuance that definition based on the data. In linguistics, there are four major readings of the perfect that have been discussed, which are the existential perfect, the universal perfect, the result perfect, and the present sative. The so-called hot news reading is a fifth reading that is typically subsumed under other readings. The existential perfect says that an event or state occurred prior to the time the speaker is talking about. Events without natural endpoints typically get this reading, such as, I have played basketball. There is no natural endpoint to playing basketball. So we interpret this sentence to mean that there exists a time before the present in which I played basketball. States can be interpreted existentially as well, but the universal perfect reading is also available, such as, I have lived in Atlanta for 3 years. In this sentence, we interpret the state as starting 3 years ago and running into the present time, meaning I still live there. Events with result states get the result perfect interpretation, such as, Amos has broken the vase. In this case, the vase is in the state of being broken, so there is a result that obtains from the event. This is the reading that most closely fits the traditional analysis of the perfect. Finally, there is the present state reading. Although this reading is more common in other perfects in other languages, we do get it in English in a sentence like, I've got $5 in my pocket. The state of having $5 simply holds in the present. Returning to Campbell, he gives 6 examples of the perfect in this chapter. John 1:26 we have already mentioned, and it would fall under the present stative interpretation. It is unique in that the state is the only thing referred to, and the prior event is not obvious. However, this reading only obtains in a limited set of verbs, the most common being oida, no. This verb is actually from the root aid, see. One can see how this kind of root developed the present stative interpretation. After you have seen something, you know it. That's the idea. As linguist Paul Kaparsky discusses, verbs that fall into this category are consistent across languages, and they usually refer to a state in which a past action can be inferred. Campbell also cites Luke 20:21, which also falls into this category. Revelation 8:5 is an example of what looks more like a perfective interpretation than what we have described as a perfect. It says, Kai ele fen ho angelos ton libano ton, kai egemisen auton. And the angel took the censer and filled it. The perfect ele fen is immediately followed by the aorist egemisen, and the two seem to be interpreted identically. In later Greek, the perfect will become the standard form for this kind of use, so it seems that we see the beginnings of that trend happening here. The Greek perfect is actually very similar to the biblical Hebrew katal form in this respect. The details of how to account for this use get a little complicated, so instead of boring you with yet another analysis, you can just check out my article on the biblical Hebrew katal form. I'd also recommend Ashwini Deo and Cleo Kandavravi's treatment of the Sanskrit ta form, which also has a similar range of meaning. John 7:22 is another example, which says, Diatuto Moises dedokin humin ten peritomein. On account of this, Moses has given you circumcision. This is probably a result perfect, though it could also be existential. The idea is that the people now possess the practice of circumcision, since Moses gave it to them. Thus, they're in a new state, namely of possessing circumcision, on account of the verb. Under the existential perfect reading, it would mean that a past action occurred prior to the time being talked about, namely the present. The next example is John 12:23, which says, Eleluthen he hora. The hour has come. In this example, the verb eleluthen, has come, refers to an event with a consequent state, namely a change of location or time. Thus, this is a result state perfect. The hour has come and is now here in Jesus' present moment. Finally, Campbell cites John 5:33, which says, Hymes apestalkate pros Ioannin, kai memarturiken te aletheia. You have sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Both of these are best taken as existential perfects. Prior to the present time we are discussing, Jesus' addressees sent people to John, and John has already told them the truth. The perfect is used because the present time is what is relevant in the discourse. John already told them the truth. Now, in this present time, they should know better. These are the examples Campbell cites against the other theories. The examples that the other theories supposedly cannot account for. I'm not going to say anything against the other theories, but the standard temporal theory of the perfect in linguistics accounts for all of them. Campbell calls the perfect an imperfective, essentially because many of the uses parallel the present form. He says, an overlooked fact in this debate is that the perfect indicative parallels the present indicative in its usage far more than it seems to do with the aorist. Campbell concludes from this that they share the same aspect, which, as we have said, he is described as something like a more detailed viewpoint. The same issues with his description of the present form as imperfective would then apply to the perfect. It is very difficult to know what he means by detailed. Moreover, Campbell is then left with 3 imperfective forms, none of which are distinguished based on tense. Because of this, he suggests that the perfect has heightened proximity in comparison to the present. So whereas the imperfect is remote and imperfective, and the present is proximate and imperfective, the perfect is very proximate and imperfective. We will come back to the idea that verbal forms can express spatial notions shortly. Campbell has not been followed by many in his analysis of the perfect form, so again, I do not want to belabor the point. However, it is worth pointing out that making the perfect form identical to the present form in aspect would be against what we see in the morphology. What do I mean by this? Both the present and imperfect forms have the same stem, and this indicates their aspect. The verb luo is luo in the present and eluon in the imperfect, with the main differences being the initial epsilon, traditionally marking the past tense, which I would also agree with, and the shortened person and number endings. The perfect form is leluka. If the initial reduplication is giving us Campbell's notion of heightened proximity, then the final ka would give us the aspect. Since the aspect is the same as the imperfective forms, we would expect the same stem. So we would expect something like the form leluon. Many other arguments could be given against an imperfective analysis of the perfect. But I touch on the morphology here because this is part of what plays a role in linguistic analysis. We are not just trying to come up with a meaning for each individual verb form, but we are also trying to come up with a coherent system that reflects both the usage and actual morphological shape of each separate verb form. Now on to the final excursus on space and time. Campbell suggests that spatial categories can better explain the data than temporal categories. Basically, there are apparent counterexamples to the temporal analysis. So instead of refining the temporal categories, he abandons them for spatial categories. He says, "It is claimed in this book that indicative Greek verbs semantically encode aspect along with the spatial value of remoteness or proximity. The difference between this description of the semantics of verbs and that of traditional analyses is that semantic temporal reference, tense, has been replaced by semantic spatial categories. It is also claimed that these spatial values of remoteness and proximity, which are semantic, normally express temporal reference on the pragmatic level." There are some foundational claims here. For Campbell, there is no time inherent in any of the verb forms. Against the field of linguistics, he defines aspect spatially rather than temporally. That we have already covered, but Campbell takes his innovations a step further. He invents a new spatial category of remoteness and proximity and replaces the tenses with them. Crucially, he claims that his categories will normally have a temporal interpretation. This means that giving temporal examples of the verb forms will not, according to him, disprove his theory. There are two things I want to cover in this section, which I think are most germane to the discussion. First is his use of the term spatial. He uses the term spatial, but he explicitly denies that the verb forms are used spatially. He says, "If I were to describe an action that occurred on my street, I am not forced to employ a proximate tense form simply because it happened close to me physically. So if the verb forms semantically encode spatial categories, then the spatial categories they encode are always present in every use of the form. But according to Campbell, the actual spatial interpretation of being close or far from something is never an interpretation of the verb form. At that point, why are we calling it spatial? Campbell says that space is being used as a metaphor, but the metaphor he mentions over and over again is the temporal metaphor. This is precisely why linguists such as Carlotta Smith have used the term viewpoint aspect. They have used a spatial metaphor for a temporal concept in an attempt to explain something temporal. For example, in Paul Krager's introductory semantics textbook, Analyzing Meaning, he quotes Carlotta Smith and explains the spatial metaphor. He says, Smith, 1997, pages 2 and 3, states, aspectual viewpoints present situations with a particular perspective or focus, rather like the focus of a camera lens. Viewpoint gives a full or partial view of the situation talked about. Krager continues, using Smith's metaphor of the camera lens, we could describe perfective aspect as a wide-angle view. The situation fits inside the time frame of the speaker's perspective. The imperfective is like a zoom or close-up view, focusing on just a part of the situation being described, when the situation as a whole extends beyond the boundaries of the speaker's perspective. The trouble is that Campbell has said that space is a metaphor, but he explicitly denies it is a metaphor for temporality, as all other linguists claim it is. Though he says the metaphor extends to temporality, it is not clear what else besides the level of descriptiveness, which we have critiqued earlier, the metaphor would refer to in his view. Moreover, one would think that if the verb forms encode spatial concepts, they would at least occasionally refer to things in space, but they do not, as Campbell admits. Second, Campbell makes a diachronic claim that verbal systems tend to change from spatial to temporal categories. He says, all languages change over time, and one of the major changes that can be observed in the history of a number of languages is that the verbal system tends to begin as a spatial system and later develops into a temporal one. This is a strong claim, and no citations are given. There are several places in the book where Campbell makes broad claims about what happens in the languages of the world or in linguistic theory without any citations. It is not enough at this point to say that this is an introductory book for students, so not everything needs to be proven. Other scholars within New Testament studies are cited plenty of times. If this was written in a scholarly work, I personally might just shrug it off and let the scholars decide for themselves whether it was right or wrong. But it is not. It is written in an introductory book for students, and they will almost certainly trust Campbell's knowledge of other languages and linguistic theory when such statements are made. However, Campbell's claim here is wrong. Besides the WALS database, which we have already said has a definition of aspect that is temporal and never once mentions spatial concepts as an option for what verbal morphemes can encode, the most comprehensive published work on the diachronic study of verbal forms across dozens of languages is The Evolution of Grammar by Joan Bybee and Company. They also define aspect temporally. They recognize that linguists use the spatial metaphor, even Comrie, but that this is only a metaphor. As is commonly recognized, they note that a spatial verb like go can sometimes have its spatial meaning bleached, meaning it goes away, and come to mean something temporal. This is true of English's going to construction in something like Amos is going to walk to the store, or Amos is gonna walk to the store. However, when this happens, the spatial meaning gets lost from the verb. They state, thus, the temporal notion is implied by the spatial one, and the temporal meaning is intrinsic to the construction all along. Thus, the real mechanism of change to be explained is how the spatial meaning gets lost. The point here is that when the spatial verb becomes a grammatical morpheme, like go, it loses its spatial meaning. It is no longer spatial, but only temporal. Here, and this is an important caveat, they are explicitly discussing lexical items, such as verbs like go, that sometimes become grammatical markers, meaning gonna might become a future marker eventually. Nowhere is there a claim that a grammatical morpheme, such as an ed ending in English or the sa ending in Greek, one that attaches to a verb, would move from spatial to temporal. Once it is already part of the verb form, it is necessarily temporal. Hence, the sa form that marks the aorist, and the ka form that marks the perfect, and the various other verbal forms that mark different tenses and aspects in Greek are already temporal, even if they had a spatial meaning at one point. And they certainly need not have had a spatial meaning at one point. If they did, now it's gone. This is true of every verb form in every language, is the claim. Spatial categories are not encoded in verb forms. Let's wrap up. One of the biggest problems I have with Campbell's book is that it is presented as if Campbell is bringing the linguistics world to New Testament studies. In part 1, 2 linguists were cited, Bernard Comrie and Marie Broman Olsen, and Campbell disagrees with their definition of aspect. I have shown that their definitions are standard. Indeed, there are no significant counterexamples. If Campbell or anyone else is able to produce linguists who clearly believe that aspect is spatial, I will be happy to take back the point that no one in linguistics believes aspect to be spatial. We would then need to discuss which camp is correct. With regard to Greek, I would say the same. If a language is produced that encodes spatial categories in its verbal system, I would be happy to discuss whether Koine Greek might also be such a language. There is no such documented language in the WALS database, which categorizes hundreds of languages. This has been an extensive review, more extensive than I had originally planned, honestly. I will stress yet again that this is for students and scholars who are confused about the Greek verbal system. Believe it or not, I am not doing this to win friends. Even after my first review, many people were upset. I don't enjoy that, okay? No one does. Others did respond positively, and I appreciate that. But I will again just encourage everyone, if you comment, be respectful to both sides. My goal is to help students to see the problems with Campbell's analysis and to try to provide a way forward for them to understand how Greek verbs work. We have to better incorporate the insights of linguistics and what they say about how meaning is constructed in language. Ultimately, it affects our interpretation of God's word. As Campbell and I both agree, it is worth doing whatever we can to get that right.